Hello everyone, this is Bruce at Red Raven Computing Studios, and today I'm going to tell you how you can get started in mobile development. I'll tell you about the equipment you'll need to have and about the mindset that you'll need to be able to become a mobile developer. The first thing as far as equipment goes is you'll need a computer. This computer will hold the IDEs or the environments where you will write your software in. You'll also use the computer to run your code on simulators. So with that said, you don't want to get a very old computer because the older it is, the harder it will have to run this type of software. You'll need very good specs, good CPU, good RAM, and a pretty decent sized hard drive to hold all this information or code to run these environments. Okay, you don't need the latest and greatest computer, but you need one that can handle the workload. And if I have a recommendation, my recommendation would be to get a Mac. And here is why. One, you have Android. Android can run on both Windows and a Mac. The Android development environment, Android Studios, and you can run the simulator on both a Mac or a Windows machine. However, with iOS, you have to have a Mac environment to run iOS, to compile it to make an iOS app. And being a mobile developer, you should be able to do both iOS and Android. You need to choose a specialty, one platform or the other, but you should have at least familiarity with both platforms because both platforms take up majority of the market share when it comes to mobile developments. Like Android is around like 80% ish or so, and iOS is more like 15% to 20% or so, and then you have Windows Phone and then the other phones. So the big two ones, the big one is Android, and the second big one is iOS, and both are popular with their respective consumers. So, and on top of that, a Mac with a Mac environment, it's much easier to get started and set up in development than on a Windows machine. Macs tend to have Git on them, and it's very easy to download other tools that you need. Whereas in a Windows machine, it gets a lot more complicated. A lot of things are not built in. Macs just tend to work when you plug in things for devices and stuff. Whereas a Windows machine, you have to sometimes download drivers and other issues. And there are problems with both, but as far as development, I highly suggest a Mac machine. But with Windows, you can develop for Android on a Windows machine. Okay. And then the second thing you should get some sort of mobile device. Now, this mobile device you can use to test on. I started mobile development in 2008 in Japan. This was the device I bought, the iPhone 3G, which was just brand new in 2008. And this was my device that I actually use personally and for development. I wrote code and tested it on this device. This is an old Android device. You use Froyo, and it's a very cheap LG Verizon phone, but you can write Froyo code, old Android code, for some testing. But as far as Android goes, I suggest you get an Android with at least Lollipop to Marshmallow, maybe Kit Kat if you're pushing it. And if you're wondering these names, by the way, what they are or what they mean, these are the versions of the operating system of Android. And I'm not going to get into the differences too much right now, but just knows that there is differences between each version. And unlike iOS, which iOS is very controlled by Apple and tends to have a smooth transition or progression, Android is very fragmented. So as far as you don't need the best, particularly for Android, you don't need the best and greatest device for testing and programming. Okay, this is a Verizon phone, no service. You don't need service. It's Wi-Fi, and I bought this at a pawn shop around 40 bucks, 30 bucks, and it has Lollipop as an operating system, but this works just fine for writing some code and testing it, as long as I'm not trying to do things that are not accessible to Lollipop. Android, very important that you know your operating systems for that, because like I said, there's differences. And then I bought this tablet on Black Friday. It's an RCA tablet, and it runs Android Marshmallow, and it works pretty good for testing out Android applications on a big screen. iOS, a little bit more expensive. You don't need to go out and get the latest greatest iOS device, particularly if you're starting out. I suggest getting a device that has some life left in it. So you don't want to go out and get an iPhone 4. You can't develop for it anymore. And you don't want to get like the iPhone 5, because pretty soon that's going to be very faded out. What I suggest is getting something like maybe the iPhone 6, because iPhone 7's out and it's the newest one. iPhone 6 is just like short one before that, 6S, and that gives you some buffer so that when the technology changes over, you're not stuck with the piece of hardware that you can't use. So I have an iPhone 6 that I bought in Vietnam when I was there, and I use this for testing and writing iOS apps. And I use it as my personal device, my personal phone. And I bought an iPad Air 2, and this is so I can develop and use for tablet, to learn designs and stuff on a big screen. Okay, so when it comes to iOS, it's going to get expensive, but you should be able to develop for both Android and iOS, or at least know enough about Android and iOS that you can do something in both. You don't have to be an expert, and you really can't be really an expert in both. You're going to be choosing one platform or the other, but to have a understanding of both platforms, and each platform is very different, and you'll learn that when you go and actually learn your coding part of this. And this video is not about the coding; it's about getting started. So those are some of the devices, and like I said, with the computer, I suggest a Mac. Mac Mini might be okay to start, but they're really not that great. I worked in some companies over in Vietnam, and they used Mac Minis. They were very slow, very hard to get things running, to load the simulator up. It was just really a pain, and then to run your tests and stuff like that, it's just really pain. It was a lot faster to actually test on the device than actually a simulator, which you might find out, particularly with Android, you might find that out. But iOS, and once you get the simulators going, it should be okay to run and do some basic testing, particularly UI. But having a physical device in your hand to run tests on, that helps out greatly, so you can actually feel the app, feel what you're doing, and you can actually see how it looks on a physical device and how it reacts to an actual test. So those are some of the equipment that you'll need. Obviously, once you get your computer, you're going to want to install the tools. I'm not going to be telling you that right now. I'm going to be something completely different, and if you're interested, there's plenty of information out there to install tools, and there's different types of tools. There's Android Studio for Android development, Xcode for iOS, Xamarin that is supposed to do both iOS and Android with one code base, which uses C#. So that might be something interesting to investigate. Then there's also Cordova, which was PhoneGap, which allows you to use web technologies, stuff like HTML. If you're not familiar with that, it's all stuff that you use to build web pages, web applications, web pages, and PhoneGap allows you to use web technology to make mobile applications, and that's it. So as far as mindset goes, which you do need to have a certain mind. One of them is persistence. You're gonna have to be persistent with this. Technology changes, and if you're not persistent, you'll get phased out. You get left behind. You won't be able to be right there to be able to do anything. You'll get bored with it, or you get frustrated when something happens, and you won't take the effort. So persistence, you need to have persistence. One, you also need to have a thick skin. What I mean by this is when you do start publishing apps or when you do start looking for work, people will find whatever way to basically tear you down. As far as an application go, you might get some people saying very mean things about your application, leave bad reviews. That stuff happens, and you just have to have a thick skin about it, because if you let that bother you, you won't continue to make new products, continue to code, and to improve yourself. Your first few apps or your first time doing this may not be the best, but you got to start somewhere. Another thing is you got to be willing to invest in yourself. You got to be willing to spend money to get equipment and to pay for classes. Why I suggest classes and invest in yourself is because a class like on Udemy or Treehouse or Lynda, those environments is very structured, and having more structure makes it easy for you to have something to follow to be able to get up to speed to where you can actually go out and start basically finding answers on your own. When you first start out, it's very frustrating. You're trying to learn how to code if you never coded before. You're trying to learn about the environments, especially if you have never done it before, and you might have some sort of timeline or deadline that I highly suggest setting up for yourself, where you want to meet. You want to meet a certain standard. In online classes, particularly, you could do this with a boot camp too. You can, if you want to, invest in a boot camp, online classes. University probably won't teach you much on it. There is on iTunes University, Stanford does release out iOS development, particularly. They do have courses at Stanford on iOS development. But anyways, you just need to start a class so you can have some sort of a point of reference to start from. Instead of trying to teach yourself and jumping from tutorial to some other things, having something structured gives you a point of reference to start from, to where you could build up your skills until you can know the flow and how things work. You can learn coding, you can learn how this works, and then you can go off on your own and start digging into Google. You're going to need to be willing to dig, research. You're going to need to be willing to work hard. You're going to need to be willing to maybe hold down a full-time job. Maybe it's not a job in mobile development. Maybe it's a job in something else. You could even be doing retail work or whatever, and using your evenings to actually study. And you're going to need to have the mindset to be able to code every day. This means on your weekends. This means in the evenings, constantly coding and constantly improving your skills, giving yourself a chance to get up to speed and to be competent. And you're going to need to have a mindset of, how I explain it, not allowing yourself to be run over. To be able to plant your feet, there's a lot of, particularly when you start getting better and good, there's going to be a lot of people out there in the world that will want you to work for them, but want you to work for them free or next to nothing. which if you're just starting out and you know the guy and it's your friend or something like that, and you might get some experience, that'd be okay. But there's a lot of like organizations, companies, other entities, and other people out there that they're not serious enough and they want you to do things for free for them. And if you want to do it for experience, that's fine. But the people will really want to take advantage of you in this. So you should really do your homework and really not allow yourself to be taken advantage of. Because as an engineer, as a coder, someone who can be able to do this, almost every industry wants to get into mobile right now. We're talking everywhere from banking to restaurants to, you can probably name an industry, retail or anything. They want to get into some mobile, and there's very good reasons why they want to get in mobile, but they want to do it for free, and they don't want to pay you, and you should have at least some compensation for your effort and work, because it will take a lot of effort and work to be able to be competent. Don't expect this to happen overnight. So just make sure you have a firm standing to not let yourself get ran over. And if you're in like the third world, as far as pay goes as a mobile developer, you should accept no less than 1,000. No less than 1,000. In the United States, you should not accept no more than, I would say, 70 to 80,000. No less than, or not no more. No less than 70 to 80,000. And the reason why is these skills are valuable. And number two is you're going to need money to be able to reinvest in yourself. The technology is going to change, the devices are going to change, and the how things go is going to change in the technology field. And you're going to have money to reinvest in yourself, to reinvest in equipment. And you're going to eventually need to get a newer computer. You're eventually going to get newer devices so you can keep up with the technology. You're eventually going to need to pay for more training. You're going to need to go to, maybe more training. You might have to pay for more online courses or whatever to get more training to become better in their skill set. Another thing is just try to meet other people who do development. Try, like in iOS, in Lehigh, Utah here, we have a Cocoa Heads meeting that meets up every third Thursday of the month. Go to something like that. Go to some other places where other developers, and meet people who do this and learn from them. There's a lot of wealth out there, and so another last part of the mindset is be willing to learn. Be constantly curious, constantly willing to learn. You do not want to stop in this. You don't want to be stagnated. You're going to constantly be learning, and if you have the mindset that you're always going to be willing to learn and that you want to teach yourself how to learn how to learn, because it's going to be very valuable. Here, you're going to have to learn how to teach yourself new skills. You're going to have to be able to read documentation, read reports and stuff, read things so you can actually do something depending on what you're trying to do in the mobile space. You're going to have to tie into websites. You're going to have to make web requests. You're going to have to learn some UI. You're going to have to learn all kinds of skills, and that's going to be constantly learning set, and you're going to have to keep updating with the technology. Another one is use the device. Choose a platform that you want to get familiar with and use that and learn its ecosystem. This is the reason why is, like, for example, an iOS developer, you want to use an iPhone, personally, maybe a Mac, and iPad. Just get yourself familiar what a user uses. How does things tie in together as an ecosystem instead of just learning how to code it? I have a good example. When I was in Vietnam, I worked at this company, and the guy who was one of the iOS developers, he had a laptop of like HP or something like that, which inside he had a boot camp, and he boot up in iOS. But this guy knew how to code. However, he didn't own an iPhone. He didn't own a Mac. He didn't own any of the ecosystem thing, and he really didn't know how a user uses the device. How the user uses the device and how they carry it with them is very important. You don't want to be not upset, obsessed with that. You waste all your time uh, using the device, going on Facebook. But you want to be familiar, though. You want to be familiar how users use the device, and there's slightly difference between an Android user and an iOS user. And iOS has its own ecosystem. Apple's built its own ecosystem that iOS users use quite often and are very quite comfortable with, and Android has a very different ecosystem and they use it very differently. Each platform is very different. You'll learn when you code; it's very different in coding, different in layout, but also different in how the user uses the device. So you can't, like you said, you can't be an expert in everything, but you can basically try the device, use it, learn the ecosystem, get a feel for that. So when you start designing your apps or building your apps for your customers or your clients or for your boss or whoever, you have a feeling of how this device is used. You have a feeling how the user is going to use it and what the user's expectations are. With that, you can become a better developer and you can do more or understand more how things work. I have seen designers design strange things for apps that cannot be done or that's not how the app is used, such as like keyboards floating in the middle of the screen type of stuff. Where if anyone uses an iPhone or I think I'm pretty sure Android does the same thing. Yeah, it does. The keyboard comes up from the bottom of the screen and then it goes down. You don't have a floating keyboard, so knowing how to use the device, you can also correct designers who may not use the device and just throw out something because it looks pretty, but it's not practical. But anyways, these are some of those tips and some of the mindset. Like I said, you got to be persistent. You're gonna have a thick skin. You're gonna have to not let people walk all over you. Uh, you're gonna have to be someone that's very familiar with the ecosystem of the platform you're developing for, so you can get in the mind of the user and get in that. As far as equipment goes, you need a computer, particularly a Mac is very useful. If you want to do iOS, you have to have a Mac environment and get some testing devices, some physical devices. Doesn't have to be the latest and greatest when you're starting out, but just something there that you can run and test on and get yourself a familiarity. Okay, this is Bruce at Red Raven Computer Studios, and I'm signing out. Have a good one.